Top fuel drag bikes have up to 1500 horsepower and can reach top speeds of 265 miles an hour in less than 5.5 seconds. Over the years they have taken many shapes and designs, but nothing comes close to the ingenuity of the Jade Warrior, sometimes called the Drag Sled due to its crazy design. It dominated when it was racing, but it's a design that hasn't been copied since. So how exactly did it work? Why was it so dominant and why has nobody copied it since? All of that coming up. Welcome back to Driver 61 and the next video in our incredible motorsport series, where we look at some of the most crazy contraptions ever to have raced and celebrate the innovators behind them. This video is brought to you by Hilltread motorsport themed socks inspired by some of the most iconic liveries in F1 and other motorsports. They produce some really cool socks such as these two, so hang around until the end of the video where we're going to be giving away 20 pairs of socks to our subscribers. The Jade Warrior took part in the top fuel category, competing against bikes that look like this. The drag bikes were able to reach speeds of 155 miles an hour by the end of the strip and often used two engines with one in front of the other. These bikes produced a whopping 400 or 500 horsepower and had specially designed elongated chassis to cope with the forces. Nowadays, drag bikes look like this, with Larry McBride setting the record of 5.83 seconds to cover the 8-mile strip. That means a top speed of 232 miles an hour before deploying the parachutes. Drag bikes use similar principles to the top fuel dragsters that we spoke about in our previous video on Dragster tyres. The engines have open headers that produce 450 kilos or 100 pounds of downforce just by themselves. Rather than using silencers to slow down the exhaust gases and reduce noise, these engines have open headers to remove exhaust gases as quickly as possible, which in turn leads to an increase in horsepower. However, there is another benefit. The sheer volume and velocity of the exhaust gases being thrown up in the air literally pushes the rear tyres down into the ground, massively improving grip and therefore start line acceleration. The bikes also use a tyre similar to top fuel dragsters, whereby the tyre actually folds and squats under initial acceleration before ballooning out for a higher top speed. This means that drag bikes don't need gearboxes, as the changing diameter of the tyre is doing that work. These things accelerate so quickly that the riders have described the feeling as grabbing onto a passing train that's running at full speed. The bikes actually accelerate to 100 miles an hour in well under a second. So back in the early 80s, the understanding of aerodynamics was becoming better, and drag bikes began to run aero covers to reduce the air resistance. And as we've seen around many areas of motorsport, this leads to some incredible looking designs. But nobody came up with a design quite as radical as Angus MacPhail and the Jade Warrior. He designed what can be best described as a sled, a head-first laid-down design that took the idea of reducing drag to its absolute limit. This is what I love with motorsport, both with the drivers and riders and the engineers that build the incredible machinery, the fact that they're pushing every last detail to the extremity, no matter how crazy the idea is. It was the first top fuel dragster to reach 200 miles an hour on standard fuel, rather than the ultra-volatile nitromethane that many of the competitors were using. The head-first laid-down design enabled him to make back the difference in power, as it had a number of performance benefits. Firstly, it cut down the frontal area of the bike by more than half, drastically reducing the drag that it produced. It also enabled him to build an extremely slippery body to further reduce the drag and making this bike look like a drivable bullet. Secondly, it placed much more weight at the front of the bike. Now, the issue with these drag bikes is obviously with all that torque, they're very likely to pull a wheelie. Many bikes even now have two stabilizer wheels coming off the rear wheel to catch the bike when it does begin to wheelie. Because Angus's body weight was so far to the front of this bike, the stabilizer wheels weren't needed, meaning a reduction in weight and an increase in aerodynamic efficiency. Incredibly, this long, low chassis also meant that this drag bike could use ground effect to create downforce even when standing still, but more on that later. So how did it work? Well, it used a 4-cylinder inline engine built by Ford Cosworth. However, Angus modified this engine heavily, with a completely custom upper crankcase and barrel that he actually cast himself. These modifications took the 2-litre engine up to about 500 horsepower. Angus had previously worked at de Havilland, the world-renowned plane maker, and Ford, where he actually worked on the GT40 project, as we know, one of the most iconic race cars ever made. This meant that he had access to high-end manufacturing techniques and exotic materials, giving him an advantage over his rivals. McPhail fitted the bike with a huge supercharger and a torque converter to drive the rear wheel. This is something that you would find in a traditional road car automatic gearbox, not like the other race clutches that other top fuel dragsters were using at the time. It enabled the weight to be kept down, but also meant a compromise in performance off the line. So rather than revving the engine and dropping the clutch when the lights went out, McPhail had to actually just directly get on the accelerator. The Jade Warrior was in fact one of the slowest bikes off the line, but more than made up for it in grip and aerodynamic efficiency. The body was made from carbon fibre, while the chassis was welded together using steel tubing to create a light space frame. And the engine was mounted at the rear with the open headers pointing upwards to increase that grip, as I mentioned earlier. However, that's not what made the Jade Warrior so special. It was the incredibly innovative ground effects system, similar to that of the Lotus F1 car of the time. Think about this for a second. This was only just happening in Formula 1. So for this to be put on a drag bike was completely out of the ordinary. Some of the exhaust gases were actually channeled down past the rear of the floor. This in turn sucked more air through the undertray and created downforce even when stationary. This is similar to the blown diffusers that we saw in Formula 1 not so long ago. The Jade Warrior also used skirts to seal the edges of the floor, much like the Lotus 79. This kept the low pressure under the car sealed from the outside air and further increased downforce. This meant that the Jade Warrior had an incredible amount of grip off the line and was also stable up to the top speed of 200 miles an hour. Despite the sled looking pretty precarious and only having a scooter wheel at the front, Angus said that the bike was relatively easy to keep under control during the runs. The bike actually produced too much downforce at times. Angus found that he couldn't do burnouts before the run due to the extra downforce. So being the great innovator that he was, he added a valve so he could turn off the system and allow himself to wheel spin that rear tyre and create some grip. All of this engineering meant that McPhail was the first Englishman to get below the 9-second quarter mile. And the Jade Warrior is still recognised as one of the most innovative bikes to ever have run. Unfortunately, it didn't win any world championships due to the more power of the nitromethane bikes, but it certainly punched above its weight. If you're enjoying this video, please subscribe to the Drive 61 channel for more incredible motorsport. So why has nobody copied this outlandish design? Well, soon after the Jade Warrior, nitromethane fuel became much more prevalent. It meant that drag bike engines were producing upward of 1,000 horsepower and had much more torque, which in turn requires incredible stiffness from the bike's chassis to stop it snapping in half. And even with the 500 horsepower that McPhail ran, he said he could feel the chassis flexing beneath him at the start of the runs. So you'd have to imagine that the chassis was at its limit and any more power would likely end up in failure. If you do want to win a pair of these heel tread socks, just comment below and we're going to pick 20 winners at random. You can also see hundreds of other cool motorsport sock designs on their website. I'll leave a link in the description below. If you enjoyed this, check out our other video on Dragster styles by clicking here. Or check out this other video which we think you'll love. Don't forget to subscribe to the Drive 61 channel for more incredible motorsport and I'll see you in the next one.